You are now listening to Podcast with a K, a podcast dedicated to legendary hip-hop duo OutKast, where I not only discuss all things OutKast, but all things Dungeon Family related too, and more. I'm your host Dan, aka DanMar, and as they say, I'm here to take you deep, straight to the point, cause it ain't nothing but king shit, all day, every day. Today I will be sitting with Roni Sarig, the author of the book Third Coast, OutKast, Timbaland, and How Hip-Hop Became a Southern Thing. Together we will discuss the rise of Southern hip-hop in the 90s and early 2000s, how OutKast fits into the picture, and how they helped blaze the trail for the Third Coast, aka the Dirty South. The title for this episode, The South Got Something to Say, is inspired by maybe the most iconic and most watershed moment in all of Southern hip-hop history. As the legendary story now goes, it was the 1995 Source Awards and tensions were high between the East Coast and West Coast crowds as it was occurring at the height of all of that drama. OutKast won Best New Rap Group and the East and West began to boo them just because they weren't East or West. Despite the unsavory vibes, OutKast coolly accepted the award and went down in history, but Andre couldn't stay silent on the disrespect, and when he spoke to the whole crowd, he let them know what he had to say and said,
"But it's like this though. I'm tired of folks, you know what I'm saying? The closed-minded folks, you know what I'm saying? It's like we got a demo tape and nobody want to hear, but it's like this, the South got something to say. That's all I got to say."
26 years later, we all now know the South definitely had and still has something to say and is a force to be reckoned with. I sat down to interview Roni Sarig, who quite literally wrote the book on the subject, to discuss this and more in depth. So I'm going to transition into the interview, and I will be back afterwards to share some current OutKast news and to close out the third episode. Okay, we're here with Roni. Roni, welcome to Podcast with a K. Thank you for being here and for sharing some time to discuss OutKast, the rise of Southern hip-hop, and more. I can't wait to get into all of that, but first I wanted to give you the opportunity to tell everyone a little bit about yourself, the book, and your experience and knowledge on the subject.
Well, thanks for having me, Dan. So I wrote a book about tonight 2008, I believe, called Third Coast, OutKast, Timbaland, and How Hip-Hop Became a Southern Thing. And that was actually sort of the culmination of the time that I spent writing about Southern hip-hop and OutKast specifically. So kind of to take it back, that was kind of like a 10-year journey that started in 1998 when I moved to Atlanta to become the music editor of the alternative weekly newspaper in Atlanta called Creative Loafing. And it was there, I actually got to Atlanta in the fall of 98. And at the time, I have to admit, I was only sort of aware of OutKast, knew a couple of their songs, but was not particularly a fan. But it just so happened that that it was right around then, like within a couple of weeks of me moving to town, that they released Aquemini. And
Timing.
Yeah. And it was also just the culmination of a lot of things going on in Atlanta, and or not culmination, because it actually got a lot bigger after that. But it was kind of a magical moment, I guess you could say, where there was just a lot happening and a lot of things coming together. And for OutKast, I mean, if you look at Aquemini, that was kind of like, all the albums are great in their own ways, but that was kind of like the classic, five mics kind of thing,
I always say about Aquemini that I have my personal favorite, but if I was going to take all biases out of it, I always say Aquemini is their unbiased best album, I think.
Yeah, I think so. It's interesting, we could talk about each album, separately, and they each have something, I think, special that's different than the others. But yeah, I think Aquemini was like the point where they were just starting, I would say, to sort of branch off in a whole new territories where hip hop had never gone before. Mm-hmm. But yet they were still more or less anchored, in hip hop. It was still a hip hop album, definitely. So whereas, the further you get out, it starts to become a little more debatable whether they were even making hip hop anymore by the end. So yeah, I mean, I think it was kind of like that magic moment when they were like perfect. They were like the perfect amount of, kind of like straight hip hop, great hip hop, and really doing something new that people hadn't heard before. So I don't know. So anyway, that's when I arrived, for that, and that was really cool. And I was like, wow, this is something special. This is a kind of a moment. It was also interesting. So I don't know if I'm getting ahead of myself, but there's a lot of things to talk about. But it was interesting, I have to say. So coming to, I mean, by this day, but today, the world of what we call alternative weeklies is kind of no longer exists. Like it's kind of a, it's sort of a relic of the past. But up until, 2010 or whatever, 2005, it was a big deal. It was like every city had their weekly, and it was kind of like this hipster, kind of left-leaning sort of, place where you could kind of pick up on like what the shows were in town and what was going on in the arts, that kind of thing. And in Atlanta, we had that too. And but the paper that I joined, it was a little bit, it hadn't yet sort of come to the realization of what was really happening in Atlanta in terms of Black music. It was, alternative weeklies, they are on the surface. They're on the surface and through, they're kind of like these bastions of sort of liberal politics and that kind of stuff. But it's still, it was, at least in Atlanta and in a lot of places, was still very much like a white, covering the white world, and so it was interesting to come there. And I think one of the things I noticed, and one of sort of my missions was to kind of make the paper, at least the music section of the paper, more representative of what the city actually was. So OutKast became, I don't know, I used to get teased for it, for covering OutKast too much, because we covered them a lot, and
I mean,
they almost became
a paper and a publication in Atlanta. I mean, it's hard not to cover them.
Yeah, you would think, but there was this idea that, we were obsessed with them or whatever. But, like I said, I honestly felt like we were the people that were closest to them. You know what I mean? That's
like a little surprising to hear too, because I've heard that type of attitude from where I'm from. I grew up in Westchester, New York, which actually you grew up in Westchester County, New York?
I didn't actually grow up, but I live there now.
Oh, you live here now. Okay. Where were you from originally?
So I grew up in Baltimore.
Okay.
So I was kind of like halfway between the North and the South.
Yeah. So I always thought like that type of attitude came from just being from me. I'm from the East Coast. I'm from right outside of New York City. So when people talk like that, I was like, well, they don't know. They're not from the South. They're not as exposed. But it sounds like there was even some skeptics down in Atlanta at the time.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know if it was skeptics. It was almost like there was sort of like a sort of ownership or sort of sense of entitlement amongst like the quote unquote, like the rock and roll community. You know what I mean?
That it was like rap versus rock kind of.
Kind of, yeah. And believe it or not, even like by 1998, which was like hip hop had been around for almost 20 years at that point, but there were still people like, why are you covering hip hop? So it was a little weird, but honestly, I mean, when I look back at my time in Atlanta, particularly as the music editor at the paper there, I really, that was sort of my, I don't know, one of my sort of proudest sort of, achievements, essentially, really, like not only in sort of bringing OutKast to sort of the mainstream audiences, I guess, in Atlanta, but also just making the music coverage more representative of what was actually going on. And to tell the truth, I mean, there was a lot of music in Atlanta, all kinds of different genres, but obviously, the Black music was the dominant stuff. And so, I think by the time I left, that was most of what we were covering, or it was a huge part of it,
Sounds like a really interesting dynamic, considering like it was like the rap versus rock early on. And in a way, I sometimes see OutKast as one of the key players that kind of did blur those lines. Once they got to Stankonia and Speaker Box the Love Below, they started to dabble more outside of hip hop, and they were starting to get played. Like Hey Ya got played on not only hip hop radio, but pop radio as well as rock radio. So they're kind of like some of the biggest impact on like blending genres and kind of breaking down those walls between rock and rap, I think.
Yeah, I think so. I agree. I mean, I think they're in general, I think OutKast, didn't necessarily feel the need to sort of conform to any particular, genre. You know what I mean? They were obviously, exactly, they were obviously a hip hop group, but they didn't necessarily need to. There was no sort of sense of orthodoxy of like, we can't do that. That's not hip hop. They just did what they wanted to do. So yeah.
So being from basically the East Coast, from Baltimore, just that time that you spent in Atlanta being exposed kind of at this peak, that's really what inspired you to write this book?
So yeah, so basically I was in Atlanta. I was directing the music coverage. It was a big section, and we were, covering a lot of this stuff, not just OutKast, but there was tons of other stuff obviously going on as well. And it became a point where, I started to notice, like if you looked at, it's pretty incredible actually. If you go back now, I don't know how it is now. I think it's changed a lot, but if you look at like the Billboard charts from like 2000, 2001, 2002, it was like not only OutKast on the charts, but like it was like 18 out of the top 20 pop songs were out of Atlanta, and were either R&B or hip hop from Atlanta.
Like Usher, you had Lil Jon going on.
Yeah, there's it was just constant. And not if it wasn't even someone like Jay-Z would work with producers, so it was always something. Atlanta had a hand in almost every song that was out.
Yeah, I just heard an interview with Killer Mike recently, and he was talking about how when Big Boy met him and he got on the Whole World song, Jay-Z heard that and then like instantly wanted Killer Mike, even though that's the only song he had ever done. He was like a nobody at the time. He instantly wanted Killer Mike, and of course Big Boy to come on to was it the Blueprint 2, I think it was, for Poppin' Tags. So just like Jay-Z, I think Jay-Z early on too, because he would reference Southern Playalistic early on, like on his like second album. And then he was, even though he's East Coast, he very much took notice of OutKast and the Dungeon Family and the South in general, because he's been kind of an advocate early on, and then brought like Killer Mike and Big Boy on. And that was like around 2001 or 2002 as well. So that fits right into the timeline.
Yeah. Plus he worked with like as far as like Virginia, he worked with the Neptunes and with Timbaland. And then he also, one of his biggest songs, Big Pimpin', I guess it was with UGK, the Texas group. And, so he was always, that was cool, I guess, of him, that he was always very open to, to new things, and to, it wasn't like he was territorial about, East Coast or whatever.
So we all know that OutKast was instrumental in paving the way for Southern hip hop, and that they were influenced by lots of genres as well as East Coast and West Coast rap. But can you tell us a bit about what and who in the South specifically paved the way before OutKast? I know OutKast was the first big success story of the South, but there were some Southern pioneers that came before them that are less famous, but trailblazers nonetheless. Is there any that you can kind of point to that kind of set the stage before OutKast really, took it home?
Yeah. So it was it's amazing to think back at how early OutKast came. They talking about 93. I mean, that was pretty early on in hip hop. I mean, that was kind of like
15 years in or so.
The gold, yeah, but I mean, that was kind of like the golden age. When I think of like, classic hip hop, we're talking like what, 89 to 92, 93. So it was like, they were really kind of there pretty early on. So in terms of like who was around, it's interesting actually, because when I think of OutKast, I do think of like, they were in so many ways, they were integrators of different sounds, of disparate sounds, and you can hear it in their music. Obviously, we talked already about like the rock, bringing in rock and stuff like that into it. But in terms of when I think of like the formula, and this is kind of, this is maybe I don't know how accurate this is, but I think it's a general picture. When you think of the formula for what made Outkast, I think of a combination, or sort of like the meeting ground between bass music, which came out of essentially that was like the main form of hip hop in the South up until throughout the 80s, I would
And
say.
that was was that basically out of Miami?
Mostly, yeah, mostly out of Miami, Two Live Crew, that kind of thing. But there was actually there were some artists out of Atlanta as well. Some that became pretty popular, and there was a bunch of hits that came out of Atlanta. I'm trying to remember, actually, it's hard to remember now, but like one that's popping into my head is like Daisy Dukes. There was like a bass music song that was from Atlanta called,
I remember
like
that one. Look at
yeah, and so
Daisy Dukes, like
exactly,
that.
yeah. So there was actually a whole bunch of and actually Jermaine Dupri and Lil Jon got started in that world, like in that bass music world. So, and you could ask Outkast too. I mean, listen to like I Like the Way You Move, and it's very much of a bass feel to it. Like, Big Boy's a huge bass fan. And so it's a mixture of that, which was also a very sort of up tempo kind of thing, mixed with what I would say is what's their names from Memphis?
3 6 Mafia.
No, before they're them too, but before them.
Are they from Memphis?
Yeah, they are. But before them, it was a group. Actually, they moved to Houston in order to become big. Two guys. Oh, MJG, 8Ball and MJG.
Oh, right. Yeah, and Outkast has a song with them.
Yeah. So I would say there's that blend of bass music, and then on the other side, there was this kind of like what they sometimes would call like pimpin' music, which a lot of it came out of Memphis and to some extent to Houston. And so when we look at like 8Ball and MJG, they were these two rappers that were from Memphis. They actually got signed to a label in Houston, so they ended up moving to Houston. And this is like, early 90s, before Outkast. They probably just a little bit before, but they first came out and they were pretty popular in the South right before Outkast. They weren't huge like nationally, but they definitely were like very influential on Outkast, and they ended up working with them afterward. So yeah, and their whole thing was a much more sort of laid back, almost like a, kind of a LA, kind of California, Dr. Dre kind of thing, almost like a very sort of laid back kind of low rider kind of vibe.
I always feel like, especially early Outkast music, I always hear the West Coast influence more so than East Coast.
Yeah.
You can hear the West Coast. A lot of that comes through because they sampled a lot, or like played around a lot with funk sounds, and so did the West Coast with funk, whereas I feel like the East Coast wasn't so funk heavy, but I always heard more of a similarity between Southern hip hop and West Coast hip hop.
Yeah, so that's another aspect. So if you look at it, so the first step, as I said, like Outkast was integrating the Miami bass sound with the Memphis kind of pimpin' sound. And then if you broaden your scope a little bit, you could also say that Outkast was integrating a whole bunch of things. One would be, like you just said, the Southern California sound that was more like funk based. Also, one element of that is this kind of live instrument thing where they used actual instruments, wasn't so sample based.
Right.
And they also mixed, I know that like Dre was a big Souls of Mischief fan. This was like, I don't know if you're familiar with them, but they were not hugely popular, but they were from Oakland. There was a whole scene in Oakland of they were part of this crew called Hieroglyphics, and it was a real kind of like their flows were like really fast and ornate flows, and you can definitely hear it in the influence that it had on Outkast. And then on the other side, there definitely was the East Coast influence on Outkast as well, where I mean, I know that like, one of their biggest they were sort of obsessed with like groups like Tribe Called Quest with DOS Effects, if you remember them. They were really into them at that time when they were first starting out. So like I said, what was really cool about Outkast is that they they just were able to sort of suck in so many different kinds of sounds and kind of make it all sound unified and give it their own, make it sort of came out as something very like original sounding.
That's true. I kind of discredited it. I kind of left East Coast out, but I mean, yeah, it really was a melting pot, because even early on too, Puff Daddy at the time, Diddy now, he was a kind of an early supporter as well. And they were touring with Biggie before his untimely death. So they had that influence right firsthand, working with like Puffy and Biggie early on as well.
Right. I think he directed the video for
Players Ball. Yeah.
Yeah.
And actually, while we were talking just now, I looked it up. I was going to mention Kilo Ali. I think he was an early
yeah.
Well, right? Even before he was with the Dungeon Family, he was making music before them.
Yeah, well, he's one of those examples of like an Atlanta-based bass artist that was, there was, like I said, there was a whole bunch of them. But yeah, he was pretty well known before. It was almost when the Dungeon Family signed him, it was almost like trying to get him a comeback. It wasn't even like they didn't discover him. If anything, it was almost like, trying to revive him.
Right.
Didn't actually go that far, but yeah, they were, so you could tell, I mean, they loved that kind of music because that's what they gravitated toward.
One of the things I just saw when I was Googling is I didn't realize that tag team that sings Whoop There It Is.
Oh yeah, right.
They're from Atlanta. I didn't know
exactly.
that. Actually.
Yeah, I couldn't remember. I was trying to think of all these songs, but yeah.
And Arrested Development.
Arrested Development was a weird case. They were 92, they came out. And they were huge, right? And
it kind of all hit around the same time, 92, 93, because even what was the other one I was just thinking about? That was the same. Oh, like Criss Cross, because you said Jermaine
exactly.
Dupri, but Criss Cross as well was like 92, 93.
So 92 was a huge year in Atlanta urban music, because I hope my dates are exactly right. I'm not 100% sure, but I'm pretty sure it was the Criss Cross album, the first TLC album,
and TLC, yeah.
And the what was the other one that you mentioned?
Was it?
The Arrested Development, the Arrested Development album.
Oh.
So their first album. So those three albums were all huge pop successes, and so that was big, and that was 92. So that was kind of like the first explosion of Atlanta music, and then, like I said, between 92 and 98, when I showed up, it was kind of like a slow buildup of not just of artists. That's the thing that people, sometimes forget about. It's not just about the artists, but it's this infrastructure of studios and producers and songwriters. And when L.A. Reid moved to Atlanta, I mean, that happened like around 92 also, I think. I mean, all that stuff, it just added
a lot of credibility.
It kept building. And then it kind of hit this critical mass, I feel like, around 98, where it became like Atlanta became the biggest. It became, when they talk about it being like the new Motown or whatever, honestly, it was 10 times bigger than Motown, because Motown was one label. This is like tons of labels, tons of producers, songwriters, everyone.
I think that like L.A. Reid and LaFace Records, along with like the Dungeon Family and OutKast, definitely brought some credibility to Atlanta, because even though there was hits before OutKast and there was other acts before OutKast really blew up, a lot of it was like kind of a novelty act, like Criss Cross, or it was like tag team where they were a one-hit wonder. There wasn't like a big band that was putting out album after album, really changing the game every time. It was kind of one-offs here and there, other than like TLC, which was more R&B. Pop R&B, but for as far as hip hop goes, they were like one of the first, like along with Goody Mob as well. They were two of like the first like legitimate, credible hip hop groups that weren't just a one hit wonder or a novelty.
Right. Yeah, I think that's definitely true. I mean, no, not taking away from Jermaine Dupri and Dallas Austin. They're amazingly talented people, but they were very much oriented towards hits and towards pop music, almost, a sort of a R&B / pop. Whereas, and so, their artists didn't always have the most staying power, say. Whereas, I agree with you that OutKast and Goody Mob were the two that the first time you were like, wow, these are actually not only legitimate, but like serious, like, artists that will stand the test of time, that were like on that level.
Definitely. So I know your book doesn't just focus on Outkast. I know we're talking about Outkast a lot. Is there any thing important we should know about other Southern hip hop players? Because I know Timbaland is in the title. Anything you want to say about Timbaland? I think you mentioned the Neptunes as well. I don't know if that's covered in the book, but if you wanted to touch on some of those others, maybe just a little bit out of Atlanta, like Timbaland and Neptunes and anyone else.
Yeah. So, I mean, the book really like it covers, at least up till 2007 or so. It covers just about everyone you could ever name. I don't think I've never been told anyone major that I left out. But for the most part, I kind of dealt with it city by city. So there's Atlanta, obviously, and then there's Miami actually was the first place, I would say. So Miami. And then the second place that really hip hop started to become big was really Houston. Ghetto Boys, that kind of stuff.
And UGK was from Houston too, right?
Well, so they were from Port Arthur, Texas, but they moved. It's only a couple hours, so they were kind of based around Houston, yeah. And like I said, the 8Ball and MJG, even though they were from Memphis, they moved to Houston to make it. And then probably Atlanta came around, and then you know what else was really active in the 80s, or late 80s starting is New Orleans with bounce music. So you had like Juvenile was around pretty early on.
True.
And some other people were even before him, some really amazing stuff actually that being made with bounce music in New Orleans. Then there was Memphis. So you had, basically they took a little bit longer, but it was like, there was 8Ball and MGG, and then there was the whole 3-6 Mafia thing, and a whole bunch of other artists came after that. And then you had Virginia Beach, or kind of like that whole area. Virginia Beach, that area is kind of weird. I don't know if you've ever been there, but it's like, there's no like central area. So it's like, sometimes call it like the Tidewater area, or, there's different names for the area because it's made up of like 10 different cities, small cities right next to each other. So I sometimes just as shorthand say Virginia Beach, but in fact, like Timbaland was more oriented towards like Norfolk, which is one of the cities, and Neptunes were more oriented towards Virginia Beach, and so but that whole area actually had some interest. I mean, they didn't have a ton, they had Missy Elliott also. So between those acts, I mean, that's not a ton of acts, but that's some of the most, some of the most important, when you think of like 90s and 2000s hip hop, between Timbaland and the Neptunes, like that was like really like, shaping the sound and creating some of the most sort of, I don't know, progressive sound in music. Like if you listen to some of their tracks, it's like, man, it sounds like space age music, like music from the future or something. You know what I mean? It's like they really created these crazy, tracks that were, incredible.
Yeah, I listened to a lot of Timbaland lately, actually, because recently Blackground Records, all their music was like tied up in legal stuff going on for like the last 20 years, or at least 10, 15 years. And that's why Aaliyah's music hasn't been available.
Right.
But they recently now made it all available. So I've not only been listening to Aaliyah's music finally, because it's finally available for streaming, but I was listening to the old Timbaland and Magoo albums, and as well as like all the features with Missy and other people as well. And yet what you're saying, definitely like the sound, like as I listen to it now and so many years later, I can like hear the like kind of like a thread that kind of connects then to now. Like, I don't know if the type of music that we're listening to today, I think that it was very much shaped not only by what OutKast did, but a lot by what Timbaland did too. Because Timbaland, in a way, even though he was never really pop, he kind of invaded the pop world a little bit more, because working with people like Aaliyah and eventually Justin Timberlake, like he brought that sound kind of to many genres.
Yeah, oh, totally. And I mean, so that's the thing, is like, honestly, when I wrote the book, ultimately you got to name it something. And so for the subtitle, I was trying to think, like, certainly I wanted OutKast in the subtitle, but who else would go? And, I was thinking, and like, if I had to boil it down, it's hard to, it's a hard choice, because there actually are a lot of really influential, great Southern acts. But if I had to boil it down to like what one other artist changed the sound of music, I would say it was Timbaland. OutKast and Timbaland were the two. Neptunes also, I would say.
Yeah, that's probably the top three. I never actually thought of the Neptunes as Southern. I guess I never knew where they were from, but since I never knew, like my gut has told me, I kind of thought of them as like a Midwest, part of the Midwest kind of like rise with, along with Common and like Kanye and Eminem, like Nelly, that type of stuff. I kind of bucket them in with that.
Yeah, it's a weird thing. I mean, because Virginia, especially Virginia Beach, it's not super Southern, you know what I mean? It's definitely the South, but it's the vibe is a little bit different. It's almost like, I'm from Baltimore, and it's probably as Southern as Baltimore is. It's not, which
like
is not
where
there.
North meets South, kind of.
Yeah, sometimes
like
they call it. I've actually
Turkey.
They were trying to.
Sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead. They were trying to make this thing stick. I don't know. It never really caught on. They were trying to call that region the Middle East.
Oh, really? Oh, yeah. So, you don't want to call it that.
Well, I don't know. I thought that was like a, kind of like the Mid-Atlantic kind of like, and so never quite caught on. But there was kind of a vibe, I would say. Even like P.D. Pablo, who was from North Carolina, was kind of part, I would say, like between. There weren't too many artists from Baltimore, but there were a few. But between Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, that was kind of almost a different region. But I grouped it in. It's pretty much South.
Trying to remember where Bubba Sparks was originally from. I know he originally ended up with the Dungeon family, at least briefly, but I think he was from somewhere like North Carolina as well.
Right? No, he was he was from Southern Georgia, so not Atlanta.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. But he ended up, I guess he must have gone to school at the University of Georgia, which is in Athens, which is like an hour outside of Atlanta. So he became much sort of oriented towards Atlanta. So he was
kind of why I thought he was from somewhere else.
Well, he worked with Timbaland. Basically, that first album was split between Organized Noise and Timbaland. And then I think in his second or third album, it became much more of Organized Noise working with him. I remember I some of the tracks on, I don't know if it was the second, if he had I can't remember. He had
Deliverance is my favorite song by him.
Oh, it wasn't. Yeah, it was before Deliverance. Oh no, wait a minute. Maybe it was Deliverance. That album. Yeah, I think it was that album. At that time, I was working with talking to Rico Wade a lot from Organized Noise, and I would go over to his house. The studio was called the Dungeon, and it was in the basement, but it wasn't the original Dungeon. He had moved out of that. He had had some money at that point, and he was living in a nice place. And I just remember the tracks, the Bubba Sparks tracks playing over and over and over again, in the background, because he was just creating them. So it's kind of cool to hear them now from that album, some of those tracks.
Yeah, I think that Dungeon, the second Dungeon, is where kind of Future kind of got his start, because Future was like very young around the Dungeon family. And I think he was kind of like practicing and honing his craft in his early years in that second Dungeon.
Yeah, that could be. In fact, I'm not exactly sure, because I regret this, but I kind of lost touch with Rico, and so he may have, for all I know, he may have moved again.
Right.
So he might be in a whole nother area now.
Right.
But
there's like a third Dungeon.
Yeah, there might be. So there was, there's an area of like Southwest Atlanta called like Cascade Avenue that kind of heads out of town. And it's it's a residential, it's a pretty nice area. It's like one of the sort of more wealthy Black neighborhoods. And so his second house was out there. It was like right off of Cascade. And it was kind of this big sort of, with the iron fence and the gate, that whole thing. So it was much nicer. But I actually went by, I think he took me by one time, the original Dungeon, that's where he lived as a teenager, basically. And although you probably heard this too, or you saw this, that Big Boy is now using it as a Airbnb.
Yeah, a really cheap one too. It's only like $25 a night.
Really?
Yeah, if I was closer to Atlanta, I would have been there already.
It looks beautiful actually inside. The neighborhood is, it's not the greatest neighborhood. It's like, a little bit run down the neighborhood,
Mhm.
but the house looks beautiful actually. Yeah.
I heard him say too that he's going to use it as an Airbnb for a little while, but then eventually he's going to turn it into a museum
Oh, cool.
for
Yeah.
for the Dungeon family. So if I don't get there to actually like spend a night there, one day I'll at least go to the museum.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, that's cool. I mean, it's interesting because yeah, that when you think of like it was really like it's a dirt floor, the basement. It's not even a finished basement, and they used to hang out down there in the dirt, sitting in the dirt essentially. So it's pretty cool to see.
if you spend the night there, they actually lock the dungeon, so you can't actually go in the dungeon. You need to like set up a tour time, and then they unlock it and they bring you in. But I guess they don't want people like because underneath the stairs and stuff, they like Andre and them, they like carve their names into the steps and
Right.
stuff. So they don't want people probably messing up stuff like that. So
Yeah.
that door is locked and you can schedule tours of it if you're spending the night there.
That's funny. Yeah.
So in your time living in Atlanta, is there any other like cool stories like that, something that's really memorable, some shows you saw or any kind of like something memorable from your time in Atlanta?
I don't know. It's funny because I was just talking to a friend of mine who he went to see Ludacris is touring, and he went to see Ludacris the other night, and he was like, "Hey, I have an extra ticket. You want to go?" And I was like, not really. I like Ludacris good enough. I have nothing against him, but it didn't strike me as going to be particularly good show. It's hard. It's hard for a rapper because they don't have, to put on a good show. It's hard. A lot of rappers don't do an amazing job of putting on a good show. And sure enough, the next day he came back and said, yeah, it was kind of garbage or whatever.
That's why actually I really liked when I saw OutKast come out in 2014, what they had a live backing band. When I've seen Jay-Z, he had a backing band as well.
Yeah.
I feel like anytime I've luckily maybe I've picked good shows to go to, but the majority of hip hop shows that I've gone to, I've always had a live band. But then like the one or two times where it wasn't a live band and it was just kind of like the backing track, there wasn't much to it.
Right.
So it wasn't as exciting as when you have the band there. Not only does it sound more organic, but you have more people up there, so there's more energy. So as great as the song is, if you're just kind of like playing the song on the over the speakers, it doesn't have that same feel of live music.
It definitely, yeah. And so a couple shows that stand out to me, but like one that stands out the most, and I don't remember. It must have been, gosh. So it was okay. So it was basically at the Fox Theater, which is this beautiful theater in downtown Atlanta, Midtown, I would say, where like historic theater. And it was Lauryn Hill was the headliner and OutKast was the opener. They kind of split the bill, I guess. They were both pretty big at that point. But it was right when like the Miseducation of Lauryn Hill was out. It was like within a year
of that. A little bit of precedent.
So what's that?
I said, so she must have taken a little bit of precedent.
Right. Yeah. I mean, she was definitely huge. But because it was Atlanta, it was almost like they had equal billing. But that was a great show. I mean, that was just like both of the acts. But OutKast was great. They not only did they have live elements, it wasn't fully live, but it was like they had like a drum, like percussionist on stage and a guitar player. Like they did have a few instrumentalists, but they brought on guests and they had like step dancers from one of the colleges. They had all kinds of fun stuff, to keep it. It was a good show. It was actually really entertaining.
Sounds like a great show too, because not like you actually saw the only two hip hop artists to ever win Grammy for Album of the Year is Lauryn Hill and OutKast.
Yeah, right. That's interesting. Yeah. Yeah, and they were both amazing. So that was really awesome. I remember that very clearly.
Now she's touring again. I heard that the Fugees are coming around.
Oh yeah. And I saw her one time, maybe, I don't know, 5-10 years ago in New York, in the city. I saw her and she was good. It was good. But the other things I remember were just kind of like impromptu things. So I remember around the time that the Cool Breeze album was coming out. So like Watch for the Hook was like the song. And that was cool because it was like, in order to help promote Cool Breeze, like all the Dungeon family guys were coming together to do these little shows, like not like big long concerts or whatever, just like they'll be at a club and they'll show up at the club and they'll do the song. So I saw them do that once or twice in Atlanta, where like the whole bunch of them was there, and that was awesome to see that.
So what can you tell me? What do you think is OutKast's the biggest impact on Atlanta? Like as a whole, like they did a lot for Atlanta for like kind of like, you know, making them, you know, giving them a place in like the music world, kind of like really making them stand out. What do you think they really like kind of was like their biggest contribution to the city and like to the cities, how people view the city?
Well, I mean, it's interesting what you said before, because I'll come back to it, because I think that Atlanta already had a lot of the, or sort of at the same time that OutKast was developing, the whole city was developing a music industry. And so there were a lot of other things besides OutKast. But like you said, OutKast was kind of like it almost gave the legitimacy, you know what I mean? So that it wasn't just sort of disposable pop music, but it was like something really heavy that you could, you could point to and say, wow, this is the band. And I mean, it's funny because like I said, I started off writing about, I wrote about rock music as much, if not more, than I wrote about hip hop. And so I grew up, listening to rock music. And, when I think about, I made this analogy at some point, and, I don't know how much it resonates with younger people, but if you know the history, I honestly think that to a large degree, I could say that what the Beatles were to the British invasion, or, the OutKast was to Southern hip hop, you know what I mean? In terms of like, they came out of that world, but they ended up like sort of going way past it, you know what I mean? Like they weren't just part of the crowd, they were like went way beyond it. And they also, they were one of the, if you think about it, they're one of the few acts that were super successful in the pop world that were both loved by critics and by fans, by the mainstream. There's really, we talked about Lauryn Hill. That's one example. Maybe Jay-Z. There's not a whole lot of acts like that really, everyone agrees. Right. Consensus. What can we call it? Consensus artist. Where everyone agrees that they're awesome. So that's another aspect. And just like, I mean, the way they kind of, especially around Stankonia and then the double album, like they just dominated, like in terms of their being out there in the charts and on the radio and all that stuff. They were just everywhere. So in that way, I honestly think that like what they did was not just for Atlanta, but like for the whole South, was kind of like they were the pinnacle, I would say.
Yeah, it's funny that you say that too about the Beatles, because I've had an ongoing, like my own like hot take, my own view on the whole thing is that OutKasts are the Beatles of hip hop. And I have, it's too much to go into now. I have lots of stories and ideas around it. Maybe I'll do an episode on it in the future, the Beatles and OutKast. But yeah, there's like a whole bunch of parallels I've kind of drawn over the years between the two. So it's funny that you say that, and I will do an episode on that in the future.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, like my sense, I wasn't around really when the Beatles were, but my sense was that they were much more dominating of the popular culture, but that you also have to take into consideration that there weren't nearly as many things going on, like there was so many.
They were the new thing. There was like, whereas OutKast was one of the new things at their time. Beatles were like the only thing at the time.
Right. And it just, there weren't that many radio stations. There wasn't the internet. There wasn't all these things, so you can't compare. Like, I wouldn't claim that they were as popular as the Beatles or sold as many records as the Beatles, but they were equivalent in some way. Yeah.
Well, because I think my next question was going to be, and you kind of touched on it already, was what do you see as OutKast's biggest contribution to hip hop culture? And I think that is like their biggest contribution, is that like they did kind of break those boundaries, kind of rise as close as you can get to like Beatles status while being true to themselves, blending a lot of genres. And that's what the Beatles did too. When the Beatles came out, they blended a lot of genres. They brought Middle Eastern sounds into their music. They basically invented hard rock with the song Helter Skelter before, like when Led Zeppelin was like coming up, like at the same time as that. So like, not only did they kind of work in like the pop rock world, but they were experimenting with Eastern sounds as well as like inventing whole new sounds like hard rock and stuff like that. And I think OutKast was very much doing the same thing. And now a lot of artists, like most hip hop artists today, I can kind of draw their influence back to OutKast. You hear people like the biggest people like Kanye West and Drake and Childish Gambino. I can name a bunch more, but all of them, I can hear the influence of OutKast. And without like Andre doing like the Love Below, I think their subject matter would be very different too, because rappers before that like weren't kind of talking about their feelings. Kanye West did it next, and then Drake started doing it and started singing and rapping. So like, I think for me, and I like to see what you think too, maybe you agree, but I think that that's their biggest influence on hip hop culture, is that they really did kind of break those walls down kind of once and for all, and influence those hip hop artists to kind of, you know, be more emotional in what they're talking about, more from the heart, and, you know, maybe introduce more singing and more different types of musical sounds to the table than they were before.
Yeah, I would agree, definitely. It's interesting though. I mean, it's interesting to hear you talk about Kanye and Drake. I agree with you actually, and Chance the rapper, like that kind of stuff. I agree with you that there's definitely an OutKast, you know, influence that you can hear in there. But you know, on the other hand, it's interesting. Sometimes I'm sort of like, man, what's going on? Like when I listen to hip hop today, and like I feel like it's actually right around the time that OutKast was stopping, there was this real deconstruction going on where I don't know if you remember, but there was a bunch of like, I forget what they called it. There was a bunch of like whisper songs, like that were like real quiet.
Yeah, well, one of them was with the Yin Yang Twins.
Yeah, right? Exactly. But then there ended up being, it was like this deconstruction where tracks started getting to be real simple and really basic, and the flows were really simple. And a lot of like when you listen to stuff today, you know, I hear that influence a lot. And I, you know, unfortunately, I mean, I don't hate that stuff, but I just feel like it's one dimensional, and it's, you know, it's very simple. So in a way, there are times where I'm like, man, I wish there was more of an influence of OutKast in the music.
Like, yeah, like you said, I think like as they were stopping, like between like 2007 and like 2011, 2012, I think it was most prominent, their influence. You could tell like even like the fun kind of beats and stuff, and the more instrumentation was like, you had people like Kid Cudi coming out at the time, who I think was also very indebted to OutKast. And like not Andre, Kanye was still making kind of more upbeat fun music, but I think over time they started to, they still do like the singing that kind of that ushered in, and they kind of talk about more like you know, more emotional kind of things, and more like, you know, more about like how they're feeling than rap did before, when it was more about gangster rap. But I think they kind of they kept that aspect, but kind of left behind the musicality. And now when I listen to a lot of the current rap music, you hear, like I said, like that influence, but you don't hear the musicality anymore. They've kind of like went for a really simplistic sound now, where it's not as much of that instrumentation.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, there's a lot. I mean, there's good stuff still. There's a lot of really good stuff coming out. But when I listen to sort of like what's popular on, you know, in rap, you know, I sometimes am disappointed like at how like simple it's gotten. It's like we've taken steps back, you know.
So hopefully now for some easy questions to close it out. So hopefully it's easy. What is your favorite OutKast album?
Okay. Well, okay, so that's, you know, I mean,
I know it's a hard one.
Yeah, well, like I said, I really think, you know, every album has something really special about it. But that, again, I think that meeting point of that sort of tipping point where they kind of were tipping from being just a really good rap act to being this like really these artists, you know, was Aquemini. And so I'd have to point to that. Although, Stankonia, I think, yeah, I don't know, maybe Stankonia, because when you look at a song like, Bombs Over Baghdad, it's like that's a tremendous song where it's like you got to start thinking like, is that even hip hop anymore? And like, that's like just like there's so much going on in that song. So
now that song is one of the top 100 songs of all time according to Rolling Stone, which
oh yeah.
17 years ago or whatever when they did the list, or 15 years ago when they did the list last time, I don't think it was even on there. But now that time has set in and it's kind of had its impact. There was 4 OutKast songs in the top.
Oh, that's interesting. I knew that Hey Ya was in it. What other songs?
Hey Ya was number 10. Miss Jackson was in the top 100.
Huh.
Bombs Over Baghdad was in the top 100, and or maybe Miss Jackson was the one that was around 150. But then also in the top 100 was International Players Anthem. Actually,
oh man, that was see, that's a great track. I mean, that's to me, that's it's weird because that really came out like at the very end, right? That was probably their last song almost.
Yeah.
And that was just like the culmination, because you got the 2 guys from Texas, the 2 guys from Tennessee, the 2 guys from Atlanta, and it just that was incredible that they got that going. And it's a great song, right? I love that. I'm glad to hear that made it.
Yep. Yeah, I was a little surprised, but I was happy that it did.
Yeah. The other song that I feel like, I think definitely gets a lot of love, but is again not, I don't know if it's even a hip hop song, but from Aquemini was Liberation, right? That's a tremendous song, right? And something like that just makes me think about what an accomplishment Aquemini was.
You can't go wrong with OutKast, CeeLo, and Erykah Badu.
Right. And there's a bunch of songs on there that are just so great.
That's why I would say that is definitely my unbiased. I think that's taking all my biases out of that. Aquemini is, I think, their peak, but their commercial peak is Speaker Box of Love Below, I think. But that's also my personal favorite. And sometimes I take heat from like old school fans that Speaker Box of Love Below is my favorite. But like you said, I don't come from just a hip hop world. I come from liking all genres of music. And the special thing about Speaker Box of Love Below is that it really did blend every genre. And I've always liked genre bending music. I don't like music that's too straightforward. I like music that's really kind of like inventive and all over the place. And I think that's what Speaker Box of Love Below was. I knew them before them because I had heard a couple songs, leading up to Aquemini. I had known Rosa Parks. I had known some of Ain't No Thing But a Chicken Wing. I knew a few songs here and there. And then when Stankonia came out, I was a freshman in high school. So I started to take notice. I was like, oh, I like these songs, but I didn't buy their albums yet. I just listened to it on the radio. And then when Speaker Box of Love Below came out, I was a senior in high school, and I did get the album and I loved it. And then I went back and listened to all the other stuff. And then now I've listened to it all a million times since then. But for me, even though I heard them before, it really started for me with Speaker Box of Love Below. And I think it is their most adventurous in terms of just, pulling from so many sounds and sources. So I always make that one my favorite. But Aquemini, I think, taking my own personal experience out of it, I would probably put Aquemini up there.
Yeah. It's interesting. I should go back and listen. I haven't listened in a while to Speaker Box Love Below, but my impression without having gone back to it is maybe it would have been a killer single album, if they just, there's maybe too much stuff on it that not everything is killer. But there's when I think about it, there are a lot of great songs on there that I still do listen to. So they're all it's all good.
I think even though they didn't all get released to the radio, I'd say there's at least there's 40 tracks on the album, but some of them are skits. So maybe you take out maybe there's 30 or so left. And then I think about of those 30 that are left, at least half of them I think could have been, successful on the radio. Yeah. But I think that Hey the Way You Move and Roses left such a shadow. They didn't even try to release anything after those songs because those were such big hits. I was always surprised they didn't try to release more from it. But I guess they just figured those 3 songs alone are enough.
Yeah. I think of Ghetto Music. I think that's an incredible song. Dracula's Wedding is an incredible song. You know, I mean, there's a lot of really good ones there.
And there's a couple songs that Andre left off the album too, because it was getting too long. They told him he had to trim it down. So the song on Gwen Stefani's album, Long Way to Go, and the song on Khalees's album, Millionaire, with both feature Andre, were actually, from what I've heard, originally intended for the Love Below, but he had to cut them. So he said, I have to cut these from the album, but I want you to put them on your albums. So then they put them on their albums. So sometimes I have a playlist in Spotify where I've worked those songs into the track list where I think they fit best as like the deluxe version of the album.
Oh, that's cool. Yeah.
Speaking of songs now, what are some of your favorite songs? I know you've rattled off a few.
Right. Gosh, I'm trying to, I mean, definitely. So Liberation was very, I felt like very moved by, so interestingly, some of the ones that I feel like are just epics are the ones that are like that are sort of like the posse tracks, whether it's Watch for the Hook or International Players Ball, like the ones that, are like almost like the events, you know what I mean? The song is an event. Those are great. Gosh, what else? I don't know, man. There's so, there's so many. Oh, like Humble Mumble, I think it's a great song.
Yep, that's one of my favorites.
Yeah, that's kind of doesn't get talked about too much, but
actually the thing about Humble Mumble that still bothers me today is I remember clear as day, and this is like 20 years ago, they were on TRL on MTV and they were talking with Carson Daly, and he was like, oh, so what's next for OutKast? And they're like, oh, we're going to release the Humble Mumble video. And I got so excited because I liked the song, but then the video never got released. So I don't know if like they recorded it and never released it, and maybe one day we'll see it, or they never recorded it. But there's always been like a hole in my heart for the fact that there's no Humble Mumble video that I thought they were going to be releasing.
That's interesting, because I don't know. I wonder if that would have been a hit. I mean, I don't know. I think of that as like an album track, but maybe that.
But I've heard a lot of people, at least OutKast fans, that really love the song. So if it wasn't going to be a hit, it at least would have been a fan favorite.
Well, I have to say, like, I remember being in Atlanta when Bombs Over Baghdad came out, and it came out before the album came out. And I just thought, wow, what a bold choice. And I was like, that's awesome that because clearly it was not a song that like people were going to get right off the bat. And so and that's, when you think of like record companies, the record company always wants to get the hit, you know what I mean? They're going to put out the easiest hit to start off with. So the fact that they put out Bombs Over Baghdad to start off, I thought was a really good choice, a really strategic choice in a way, because it was like, this one might not become a huge hit, but this is just to show you what they're capable of, or what's coming on this album. So it was tremendous. And actually, at least in Atlanta, the hip hop station, the main hip hop station, they embraced it. They played it a lot for a while.
It was a great song at just getting people's attention, because I remember the first time I heard it, I was like, what is this? This is so different. And then I think obviously it took on some symbolism because of the Iraq war that followed and everything like that. I think that's why I think it's like in the top 100 songs of all time now, because not only was it a great song that kind of like caught everyone by surprise, but it also has some historical significance now.
But I also think of like
some interview with a soldier or something like that, that's saying when they would go to battle, like they would actually play that song when they were were like trooping across the desert.
I mean, I think of that song, okay, like you basically start with some like basically drum and bass, and then it goes into really fast hip hop, like kind of bass music, and then there's this rock guitar solo, and then there's a gospel choir, and then it's just like, man, it's like all over the place. There's so much going on. So it's a great song.
It did its job, because I remember Big Boy saying something like, when they made Stankonia in general, but I think B.O.B. as the forefront, they wanted to like kind of like give hip hop a shock. Hip hop had kind of become complacent, and they were just kind of like following a formula at that point, like in the late 90s, early 2000s, like they know what was going to be a hit. So they were following a formula, and Big Boy said something like they just wanted to like shock the system. And I think that's what they did.
Yeah, and again, like I think after Rosa Parks, and they could have they could have put out Miss Jackson right away, and that would have been a huge hit and all that. But like, yeah, I give them a lot of credit for seeing the big picture of like this. We got to get this out there. So that was cool.
Yeah, I know OutKast too. They have so many great songs, and it's hard to pick a favorite song. So I commend you for putting together a few, because I'm still kicking myself today. Because when I met Andre 3000, I met him. Was it like? It was like 4 years ago. I met him at Complex Con in Long Beach, California.
Mhm.
And when I met him, I'm going to go into this more in a future episode as well, but Farnsworth Bentley was there as well.
Mhm.
So me and my best friend were there, and I was meeting with Andre, because I actually won a sweepstake. So they actually they carved out like a big chunk of time for me to hang out with Andre.
Mhm.
So when I hung out with him, and then Farnsworth showed up, and he put me on the spot and was like, "What are your favorite Andre verses?" And it never even occurred to me to prepare an answer for that. I didn't think I would have that conversation. And I was so rattled by it, because I was in front of Andre, and I was like, oh my God, I don't want to say the wrong thing. And I can't remember exactly what I named, but I remember talking to my friend after, and I was like kicking myself, like, oh, why did I say those songs?
Honestly, Andre probably was so embarrassed just to have you say it. You know what I mean? He's so like, humble. He's not even like trying to hear like what your favorite verses are.
That's why Farnsworth had to be the one that asked that.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, actually, it's interesting. As we were talking, I know a story popped into my head, or kind of just some information related to the Third Coast book, and the kind of the history of how it evolved. So initially, the idea was to be a book about OutKast, right? And this is probably, I mean, it took a while. So this is probably like 2004, something like that. And I at that time, again, because of my job and all this stuff, I was seeing them fairly regularly. Like I was kind of like running into them. I would actually, it was cool because I would, Andre was always very sort of approachable. I'd run into him in the record store or whatever, and talk to him for a while. And, I had been over their houses for stories and stuff. So I knew them, and I was seeing them regularly. So I was like, man, I should be the guy to write the biography, and so we sold my agents sold this book. The publishing companies were like, yeah, absolutely. If you have a official authorized, OutKast book, then we want it, And so I was like, yeah, I asked both of them individually. I asked, are you interested in doing a book, that I would write? And they were like, yeah, sure. That sounds good. Let me know, call, whatever. And ultimately, I mean, it's, I don't take anything away from them, because they, they're nice guys. And they were just like, just talk to our manager about it. So ultimately I had to go to the manager, and it was Blue Williams, and, and he was like, absolutely not. It's not happening. So yeah, basically
like
I could
cop,
do
bad cop. They get to be the good cops.
Right, exactly.
The manager's the bad cop.
So I could do the book, but it wasn't going to be authorized, so it was like, not as fun. And then it evolved, and at that time again, I was spending a lot of time with Rico, and so it started to be like, well, maybe Rico was not only there for OutKast, but he was there for TLC and for for all kinds of stuff, for LaFace Records and all this stuff. So maybe it should be like his book, like through his eyes or whatever. And we pitched that a bit, and there was some interest, but it was not as clear. And then so it wasn't until like the third go that I finally, was like, okay, it's going to be a history of Southern hip hop, the whole thing, that I finally got the book sold, and and it all worked out. So yeah, so it took a while, but it did start as an OutKast book, actually.
So one more thing I wanted to say to my previous thought on with Farnsworth putting me on the spot. If I could have a redo of my 5 favorite, I guess he asked Andre verses, so it's really Andre verses, but so it's not necessarily my favorite songs, but with his verses, but some of them are my favorite songs too. I've prepared it now because I have a second chance to do it. I would say Millennium, Aquemini, the title track, Synthesizer. So right there, like 2 of them are from Aquemini, Humble Mumble, and The Art of Storytelling Part 4.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So that was actually, I think that was the last song they did together, but it was like on a mixtape, so it didn't get as much attention. But Andre's verse in that is just off the charts. Yeah. So Roni, I want to thank you for your time today and joining us. Before we go, I just wanted to give you the opportunity to tell the audience where they can purchase Third Coast and what other books you have out there or any other news you want to share before we close it out.
Yeah, thank you. So it's best place to get it, in my opinion, because I stand to make the most from it this way, is to buy it from my website. It's got a totally safe transaction system, whatever. And it's Roni, Roni Sarig, Sarig, so all one word, RoniSarig.com. So if you go there, you'll see it's for sale, Third Coast. I also actually this is totally, on a different level, but I actually just recently put out my first children's book. So it's like it's a graphic novel for kids called Rocky Princess Astronaut. So, and that's for sale too. So you can actually get a package deal, save $10 if you get both of them at the same time. So, so that's definitely the best place to pick up the book. Still got, a bunch of copies and yeah, definitely look it up.
Yeah, I'll put the link in the episode description too for everybody.
Okay.
All right. Well,
great. Thank you so much. Thanks for having me, Dan.
Take care.
All right. See you.
Bye-bye. So there's not much OutKast or Dungeon Family news this month, and there's unfortunately still no update on when Big Boi and Sleepy Brown will be releasing the long-delayed Big Sleepover album. I guess we'll just have to sit tight for that. But there was a mini arcade-style video game released online for ATLians late last month. It's not much, but it was cool to mess around with for a few, so be sure to check that out for a little fun. Also, if you've seen Big Boi's Instagram stories, you may have seen his posts from a bunch of Oregon Ducks games as his son Cross attends college at the University of Oregon and is the running back for the football team, the Ducks. A few weeks ago, news broke that Andre attended a game too. Yep, OutKast was at an Oregon Ducks game together, and not only were Big and Dre there to see Cross play, but Dre's son Seven was there too. It was truly a family affair, and it's only fitting that the son of a member of the Mighty O would attend a school that uses a big O as their logo. It just needs wings added to it. You hear that, UO? I actually know someone who attends the University of Oregon, and he was at that game and other games too, as he's a part of the band, so I always get good updates on the team, Cross, and Big Boi and OutKast appearances. Go Ducks! And that brings me to the end of another episode. I want to thank everyone for tuning in again. I hope the conversation was interesting and informative. If you have any feedback or ideas for episode topics or interviews, please feel free to reach out to me in the companion Facebook group OutKast, Andre 3000, and Big Boi, which is linked out to in this show's RSS feed homepage. Also, be sure to grab a copy of Roni Sarig's book, Third Coast, OutKast, Timbaland, and How Hip Hop Became a Southern Thing. Next month's episode will be another album deep dive, this time for OutKast's second album, ATLians. So until then, greetings, Earthlings.